Hey, you cool cats and kittens. It's Miss Yabut again. Scholars, I am so excited because next week we will be starting our very first historical fiction novel. Can you say so cool? Good. Scholars, remember that every time we read historical fiction, we always have to ask ourselves these questions. How is the setting important to the plot of the story? Yesterday, we read the harmonica, and we know that that took place during a real time and place. The setting was so important to the plot of the story because we know that a big problem that the boy who is Jewish was having was that he was separated from his parents and put in a concentration camp. We would not have known that if we didn't know that the setting was during the Holocaust in Poland. Scholars, we also want to ask ourselves, what can stories teach readers about the past? We've learned so far that a lot of really terrible things have happened during World War II, especially the Holocaust. What can we as readers learn about that through stories like the harmonica and through stories like we'll read next week? Finally, it's important to always ask ourselves, how do readers distinguish fact from fiction while reading historical fiction? Some of us got a little bit tricked on this yesterday in our open ended questions. Remember, a fact is anything that we learn from the article that we know happened in real life. So that was a real time, a real event, a real person. What is fiction is anything from yesterday that had to do with the boy and his family. So even though the boy shoveling snow was an example of how Jewish people had to do hard labor in the concentration camps, that still was fiction because the boy is not real. So anything that has to do with those characters in the harmonica was in fact fiction. Let's review what historical fiction is. Remember that we can always go into our resources in classwork and click on our historical fiction resource. Scholars, say it with me. Historical fiction is an imaginative story that takes place in the historical past and may have some real events or people. One more time. Historical fiction is an imaginative story that takes place in the historical past and may have some real events or people. Your turn. Historical fiction is an Good job, friends. I want you to take about 45 seconds and answer our first question on your own. What kind of text is historical fiction? And which of the following are characteristics of historical fiction? Select all that apply. Again, make sure that you are working on these first two questions and using your resource. Get ready and go. Ten more seconds, scholars. Let's go over our answers. ELA Masters, if you wrote that historical fiction is a narrative text, give me a high five. Right. We know that historical fiction is a fictional story. It comes from the author's imagination and is make believe. The harmonica, which we read yesterday, was make believe. It came from the author's imagination. What were some characteristics of historical fiction? First, we know that the setting is important. Like I mentioned, yesterday's text of harmonica took place during the Holocaust in World War II. And that was a big part of the problem that the boy was experiencing in the story. So if you selected this first answer choice, show me a yes. Good. Our second characteristic is that it is often focused on, yes, real issues. And the characters, in this case, the boy, who is fictional, not real, the character's perspective of them. So the real issue was that the Nazis were taking Jews and either starving them or even killing them because they hated them. That was a real issue of that time and early 1940s. And the boy's perspective of, for example, the Nazi commandant was that he thought he was evil and cruel. The Nazi commandant's perspective of the boy was that even though he was talented, he still did not like the boy because he was a Jew. So if you selected that second answer choice, give me a high five. Nice work, friends. Our final characteristic of historical fiction is that some values, perspectives, and living conditions are different from today. We talked about this yesterday, but the values that the Nazis had, that Jews were less than human, is not a value or perspective that's held by anyone today. Now, in 2020, it is considered unacceptable. Scholars, if you selected this last answer choice, show me a yes, yes. Good. Scholars, historical fiction is not a nonfiction text. When we read the Holocaust, that was a nonfiction text because it had real facts. But yesterday's text of harmonica was not nonfiction. It used some real facts, but it was a fiction text that came from the author's imagination. Remember that as good readers, we often read a nonfiction text before we read a fiction text because it builds our schema, right? ELA Masters, today we will be reading about a time in the historical past that came a little bit after the events that we've been reading about so far. This text will help us understand the novel, the historical fiction novel that we'll be reading next week and the week after. We will be reading, drumroll please, one of my favorite books, friends, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Can you say whoa? This story is a little bit different than the other historical fiction texts we've read so far. This text is actually partially true. It is based on a real girl who really lived during the setting that we'll be talking about, but parts of the story still come from the author's imagination. Parts of the story are still fictional. If parts of the story are still fictional, scholars, then the whole text is still considered historical fiction. Again, is this text nonfiction? No, this text is historical fiction. The girl in this book, Sadako, who was, again, a real person, lived about 10 years after a terrible bomb was dropped on the country of Japan, which we read about earlier this week. Today, we will be reading a nonfiction infotext article called The Atomic Bomb to learn more about what happened and why that happened. ELA Masters, can you remind me what kind of text am I reading today? What genre? Yes, I am reading a nonfiction infotext. If you need to, pause your video and select that now. Good. Now, can you remind me, why do good readers sometimes read nonfiction before reading a historical fiction text? Why are we reading The Atomic Bomb before we read Sadako? Tell me. Yes, you got it. Wow, I was impressed that some of us even knew without even looking at our resource. Reading nonfiction first builds our schema. Good. Let's write that in here. It builds our schema. Oh, Miss Yabut almost forgot a capital letter. If you need to, pause your video and double check your answers now before moving on.